Hello and welcome to our next lesson on this competition and adaptation module. In the previous couple of lessons we've looked at natural selection, we've looked at extinction, and today we're going to look at inherited disorders. So today's title, as you would do for any other lesson, you need to write in your books please, inherited disorders. By the end of the lesson you should be able to define what a genetically inherited disorder is. You should be able to explain how scientists predict the chances of a couple having a child with a genetically inherited disorder, and you should be able to draw Punnett squares to predict the probability of a couple having a child with a disorder. So, first things first, let's start with a key word. Genetically inherited disorder. So, genetically inherited disorder. Now, a genetically inherited disorder can be defined as a condition passed on, so a condition passed on from parents to offspring via their genes or in their genes. Now, sadly, if you have a genetic disorder, it is very difficult to treat these sort of things. Okay, your genes determine, as we've seen in previous lessons, determine what your body has and what it can and can't do. If you have a particular gene for a particular disorder or for a particular illness, then sadly you're kind of stuck with it. Okay. Now, examples of genetically inherited diseases include, so we can put e.g. hemophilia. Hemophilia. You don't need to know this, but hemophilia is an illness where your blood never clots. So if you get a tiny little cut, it will never scab over and you would bleed to death. So hemophilia is a very dangerous one. Another one is polydactyly. Polydactyly is an illness where you have extra fingers or toes. So rather than having 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand, you may have 6 fingers and a thumb on each hand. Okay. And finally, another one that we need to talk about, which we are going to focus on today, is cystic fibrosis, and this is one we are going to focus on. So cystic fibrosis. And we can just talk a little bit about it so you can understand why we're talking about this one and why it's a problem. So cystic fibrosis. Essentially, cystic fibrosis is where you form very thick mucus. Okay, so sufferers have a gene that forces them to produce lots of very thick mucus. Okay, so if you have cystic fibrosis, you form very, very thick mucus. Now, this excess mucus can make it very hard for you to breathe. It can make it very hard for you to absorb nutrients from your food, and it can make it very hard in having a child. So we can say that the thick mucus makes it difficult to breathe. absorb nutrients from food, absorb nutrients from food, and get pregnant. Okay, so if you have cystic fibrosis, it can make it very difficult for you to breathe, it can make it very difficult for you to absorb nutrients from your food, and it can make it very difficult for you to get pregnant. This is because you produce a very thick mucus which stops these things from happening efficiently. This is because the sufferer has a gene, they have a specific gene that causes them to have this problem. Now this is where I'd like to introduce us to the word allele. There's going to be a lot of keywords today, I'm afraid, and you need to be able to use them. So allele. Okay? An allele is a different form of the same gene. So a different form of the same gene. So for example, eye colour has different alleles. You can have an allele for brown eyes, an allele for blue eyes, an allele for green eyes, so on and so forth. So we can put underneath here, e.g. eye colour has the alleles blue, brown, green. And there are other colours, but you get the idea, okay? Cystic fibrosis is caused by what's known as a recessive allele, and we'll come to that in a moment, okay? We can add underneath allele, before we move on to that, we'll refresh the screen in a minute, perhaps I shouldn't have said that just yet, but we can add underneath allele that for each gene you get one allele from your mum, one allele from your dad, okay? So for each gene, we have two alleles, comma, one from mum and one from dad. Now if we go back to the analogy of eye colour, I might have, so for me personally, I have green eyes. However, I may have got the allele for brown eyes from my dad and the allele for green eyes from my mum. However, I have got green eyes. So even though I have got these two alleles, I've got one brown from my mum, one brown from my dad, one green from my mum. I have got the green eyes, but I have both alleles in my DNA. Okay? I am going to have to refresh the screen. I am going to sneeze as well, so I'll forewarn you before I deafen you. So, before I said that earlier, I said to you that cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele. So cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele. Okay? Now the question is, what do we mean by this word recessive allele? So our next keyword is recessive allele. Now a recessive allele can be defined as the following. A characteristic where two of the same allele are needed for the person to have the characteristic. Okay, so a recessive allele is a characteristic where two of the same allele are needed for the person to have the characteristic. Now, I am going to write here, it might not make much sense at the moment, but it will later on. A recessive allele is always shown with a lowercase letter. So, is always shown with a lowercase letter. Okay. On the other hand, a dominant allele is a characteristic where you only need one of that allele for the person to have the characteristic. So a dominant allele is defined as a characteristic where only one of the allele is needed for the person to have the characteristic. For the person to have the characteristic. Okay. Now, dominant alleles are always shown with a capital letter. So we can put underneath here, is always shown with a capital letter. So what we've said is that a recessive allele is a characteristic where you need two of the same allele to have the characteristic, whereas a dominant allele is one where you only need one of the letters to have that characteristic. Cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele. So in order to have cystic fibrosis, you need two of the cystic fibrosis allele. So we can finish this slide off by saying, in order to have cystic fibrosis, a person needs to have two of the cystic fibrosis allele. Two of the cystic fibrosis allele. In order to have two of them, they have to have one cystic fibrosis allele from their mom and one cystic fibrosis allele from their dad. Okay? If someone only has one recessive allele, they are said to be a carrier. A carrier. Okay? C-A-R-R-I-E-R. A carrier is defined as a person who has one copy of a dominant allele and one copy of a recessive allele. Okay? Now, if you only have one copy of the recessive allele for cystic fibrosis, you do not have the illness yourself, but you can produce children with the illness. So we can add underneath here by saying that carriers do not have cystic fibrosis but can pass on the cystic fibrosis gene, neaten that up a bit, the cystic fibrosis gene to their children. Okay? So a recessive allele is where you need two of the same allele to have that characteristic. Cystic fibrosis is caused by recessive alleles and therefore you need two lowercase letters or two recessive alleles to have cystic fibrosis. A dominant allele is where you only need one of them. If you are a carrier, you have one dominant and one recessive and therefore you don't have the illness yourself, but you can pass it on. So, let's have a look at how geneticists do this. And I'm going to start this by using an example. Okay? I want you to imagine two carriers for cystic fibrosis want to have a child. So we can say two carriers for cystic fibrosis want to have a child, comma. What is the probability? What is the probability of their child having cystic fibrosis? Okay, this is the sort of question you will be asked. So, from the question, we can work out that they are two carriers for cystic fibrosis. Okay, cystic fibrosis is only given to people if they have two recessive alleles. So what we can start by doing here is we can start by drawing a key. Okay, so our key, which I will put here, we've got a key. We can say that a capital letter, a capital C even, is dominant alleles, and we can say that a lowercase c is a recessive allele. Now, we've said that the parents are both carriers. So if we have a think about what their genetic makeup could be. So the mother is a carrier. Okay? That means that she must have one dominant allele, a capital letter, and one lowercase letter representing a recessive allele. On the other hand, the dad or the father is also a carrier. So the father is also a carrier. Therefore, he must also have a capital letter C for a dominant allele and a lowercase c for a recessive allele. If ever you have a question about asking you to draw a Punnett square, which we're going to do in a moment, you must always use the same letter. Okay? I've used the letter C and I'm using one capital, one lowercase. You can't have a C and an F. You can't have a C and a Z. You must always use the same letter. However, sometimes they will tell you the letter to use. So, from the mother, her eggs, so her egg cells can either have inside them a capital C, which is dominant, or a lowercase c, which is recessive. So the mother's eggs are either a dominant or a recessive. At the same time, the man's sperm or the male sperm cells, so sperm cells, are either a dominant allele, a capital, or a recessive. Remember, for every gene in your body, you receive two alleles, one from your mum and one from your dad. So what we could do is we could write down here our possible outcomes. So possible outcomes. And what we could do is we could draw an arrow from one from the mum, one from the dad. And then we could go one from the mum. In fact, we could fill it in as we go. So we've got a capital from the mum and we've got a capital from the dad. We could then do our next cross. We could go one from the mum, one from the dad. And we've then got a capital from the mum and a lowercase from the dad. We could then do our next cross, which would be this one from the mum and this one from the dad. Whereas this time it would have a capital C from the dad and a lowercase c from the mum. And then we could have our final outcome, which is over here. We've got our lowercase from the mum and our lowercase from the dad. But as you can see, although this is a valid way of doing it, you can see that this is very, very messy. We could neaten it up quite easily by drawing circles around our outcomes. And we could divide this up by saying that these two are carriers for the illness. So this one and this one are carriers because they have a lowercase allele and one dominant. This cross sadly has cystic fibrosis, and this one here would be a normal person, not a carrier, doesn't have the illness. But a much better way of doing this and a better way of showing it is through using a Punnett square. A Punnett square. And a Punnett square can be defined as a frame used to predict genetic crosses. Okay? So to do a Punnett square, we can do it for this. We can simply just draw lines like so, one there, one there, and rather having this messy one over here, at the top we can write the mother's genes. Up the side we can put the father's genes. And we would just put the father is a carrier, so he has a capital C and a lowercase c, and the mother is a carrier, so she has a capital C and a lowercase c. Make that a bit more obvious because it's quite big. A lowercase c. We can then fill in what each parent gives. So in this column, the mother gives a capital C and a capital C. In this column, the mother gives a lowercase c and a lowercase c. In this column here, the father gives a capital C and a capital C. And in this column here, the father gives a lowercase c and a lowercase c. Each of these crosses is worth 25%. So if we look at this, it shows exactly the same as what we've got here. We've got a normal person, or a person who's not a carrier nor a sufferer. We've got a carrier here. We've got a carrier down here. And we've got a sufferer of cystic fibrosis. I'm just going to put capital C, capital F. If each one is worth 25%, so I do need to write that somewhere, each cross is worth 25%. We can say, to answer this question, that the two carriers have a 25% chance of having a normal child, a 50% chance of having a carrier, and a 25% chance of having a sufferer of cystic fibrosis. So, you should have now written down these notes if you haven't. What I would like you to do, please, is I would like you to get a different coloured pen ready. It doesn't really matter. However, if you've got a green pen, that would be ideal because that's what we normally use. And I would like you to have a go at the questions that are currently on the board. I'd like you to pause the video for question 1. You need to write out the sentences, filling in the gaps. For question 2 and 3, you need to write out the question and then have a go. So pause the video now, get a different coloured pen, press play when you've done all the questions and you're ready to mark them. Okay, so hopefully you should have had a go at those questions. Let's get them marked and then put an end to this video. So if I can make this a little bit bigger so that I can annotate it, put it up here. So for question 1, it should have read, just get a red pen, genetically inherited disorders are passed on from parents to their offspring. through their genes. The disorders can be caused by dominant or recessive alleles. If a disorder is recessive, you need 2 copies of the allele to suffer from the disorder. If a person has only 1 copy of the allele, they are called a carrier. So let's get the next set of questions up. I will leave that on the board, don't worry. I wonder if we can fit that at the bottom if we make it small enough. Oh, look at that. Oh, look at that. So question 2 says, so number 2, explain why most people would not know that they are a carrier of a genetically inherited disorders. So if you are a carrier, you do not have the symptoms of the disorder. So carriers do not have symptoms of the disorder. Okay, so if you are a carrier, you do not have any symptoms. Now, this is because you only have 1 recessive allele. So we can put this is because carriers only have 1 recessive allele. Okay. And we can say that a person needs 2 recessive alleles to have the illness. So a person needs 2 recessive alleles to have the illness. So for 3 marks, you needed to say that carriers do not have symptoms of the disorder. This is because they only have 1 recessive allele, and a person needs 2 recessive alleles to have the illness. Final one, question 3. Question 3 says, use a Punnett Square to explain why a child could not suffer from cystic fibrosis if his mother's alleles were capital C, and his father's were that he was a carrier. So we can draw a Punnett Square for this. It's asking you to draw a Punnett Square. And it doesn't matter which way round you have the mother and the father, but I'm going to put the mother up here. So mother alleles, and we can put father's alleles. Okay, it tells us in the question that the mother's alleles were dominant and dominant, whereas the father's were dominant recessive. Okay, what you would then need to do is the cross. So you're going to have 2 dominant from here, you're going to have 2 dominant from here. You're going to have 1 dominant from here, 1 lowercase, and 1 dominant from here, 1 lowercase. By looking at this, it's evident that you cannot get 2 recessive alleles in this cross. Okay? So if you've done this cross, you get 3 marks. Your 4th mark comes from saying cystic fibrosis needs 2 recessive alleles for the person to be a sufferer. Okay, so for the person to be a sufferer, you need to have 2 recessive alleles. In these parents, this is for your 5th mark, with these parents, there is a 0% chance, there is a 0% chance of having 2 recessive alleles. Okay. For the final one, you needed to say for the final mark that they had a 50% chance of being normal and a 50% chance of being a carrier. So you get 3 marks for the correct Punnett square, 1 mark for saying that the cystic fibrosis needs to have 2 recessive alleles for the person to be a sufferer. You needed to say that with these parents there is a 0% chance of having 2 recessive alleles, and then you needed to say that there was a 50% chance of having a normal child and a 50% chance of having a carrier. So you should now be able to tell me where a genetically inherited disorder is. You should be able to explain how scientists predict the chances of couples having a child with a genetically inherited disorder, and you should be able to use a Punnett square to predict the probability of a couple having a child with a genetically inherited disorder. This has been a very difficult lesson. If you have any questions, please comment below in Google Classrooms or send me an email directly, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Until the next video, I will see you then.